I mean, I only really sort of found out about ADHD sort of and understood what it really meant on a practical level through the internet and through seeing other people's posts about it and being like, oh, this sounds very familiar. It sounds suspiciously familiar. You know, I didn't ever do homework. So that's not an exaggeration. I did not hand in homework ever. I was constantly late to school. I was in detention pretty much every day. But in terms of my learning, I've never had an issue with grasping concepts or, you know, with the learning part of learning. It's all of the other stuff, you know, the doing the homework, doing the assignments, doing them on time. That's a big one. You know, it kind of gave me permission to let go of some of the shame that I'd been feeling for all of those years, because I was like, oh, there's a word for this. There's an explanation for this. It all makes sense. It was really a light bulb moment.
Welcome to the Qualified Tutor podcast. I'm your host, Ludo Miller, and I'll be interviewing tutors and thought leaders from across the tutoring landscape to inspire, inform, and motivate you to become the best tutor you can be. The Qualified Tutor community is a safe and supportive space for tutors who love to learn and grow. We offer training, resources, ideas, and a chance to connect with like-minded tutors. If you'd like to continue the conversation, join our Qualified Tutor community at www.qualifiedtutorcommunity.org or find it in the show notes. Welcome to Cleo Tucker O'Sullivan, a science and maths tutor currently completing an undergraduate degree in biomedical science at King's College London. Cleo is an active and insightful community member, lending her experience and wisdom to many areas, but in particular the area of accessible education and the advancement of educational opportunities for disabled students across the board. Diagnosed with ADHD post-sixth form after years of trying to understand why other students had no trouble concentrating, Cleo is now a vocal advocate for greater awareness of the issues ADHD diagnosed and all disabled students face in today's education system. We welcome Cleo on today as a community member, a tutor, a university student, and a voice for change. Now, usually we ask, as a starting question, what kind of learner you are. However, as this is going to be such a key part of your experiences and advice today, Cleo, we're going to ask it slightly differently. But first, we have to start with your inspirational blog that you wrote for Qualified Tutor last week, originally published on the platform Medium. It details your journey from the early days at school to diagnosis and then on to what lessons you've taken from your journey. That's just a little summary for listeners. Now, I have to ask, how long did it take you to write?
So this is a funny question, because this is very sort of about what the ADHD process is I'll sort of have a fixation on something and be like, okay, I'm going to do this thing. And, you know, you sort of get into the zone and you get kind of like hyper focused on it. And so the bulk of it was written in probably a couple of hours. And then there were a lot of revisions. I wrote it probably maybe across 2 days. Like I wrote sort of one half on one day and then wrote the other half on another day. And then I sent it around to a lot of people, my friends, just said, hey, does this look terrible? Can you, tell me this isn't like the worst thing and I'm not making a terrible, terrible mistake. But it was a very happy coincidence, because when I published this originally on Medium, it was ADHD Awareness Month. And I had no idea when I started writing it. And it just so happened to coincide. So that was really great, because I was like, this is an excuse for me to post this. And then it was accepted for publication. And the rest is history, I guess.
The rest is history. Look where you are now. You say that you're someone who doesn't necessarily like to open up and talk about their experiences, but here you have this amazing blog. Here you're featuring on a podcast. This is
it's all very strange. If you had told me sort of a couple of years ago that I would be as open as I am now, or at least as I'm trying to be now, I probably would not believe you. Because I've always been quite a private person, but seeing the impact that other people in the community have made on me and on other people in encouraging people to seek diagnosis. I mean, I only really sort of found out about ADHD sort of and understood what it really meant on a practical level through the internet and through seeing other people's posts about it and being like, oh, this sounds very familiar. It sounds suspiciously familiar.
Hey, I have that too.
Yeah. Hey, I think maybe I should do something about this. So, and I hope that that's something that that maybe this blog does for me. I've seen a couple of people have reached out to me and said, oh, this was really helpful, and this really made me think that I should seek a diagnosis, and that makes me feel great. And I also heard that someone cried when they read it, so that made me feel amazing. Makes me sound terrible to say that, but it feels good to have that much of an impact on someone,
Yeah, I am in a similar vein, Cleo. I heard today that one of the students I tutor finally, after about 5 or 6 rejections from different schools, got into his final school. They were praying, his parents were hoping and praying, and apparently they interrupted his live online lesson that he was having that day, pretending that there was a fire alarm in the house. And so he sort of ran out really worried, and then when he got out the door, they both hugged him and they showed him the results of the school, and he just burst into tears. So I think it's obviously, tears can come from any kind of emotion, really, but I don't think that hearing that someone has cried or has been brought to tears by that blog is any bad thing.
That makes me feel better.
Yeah. So what's kind of obviously in the article you mentioned your journey from A levels to through to where you are now, but and you touch a great deal on the mid part of the blog is very much about the diagnosis and the kind of the relief and also the pain that comes with that. But as someone who's diagnosed with ADHD, what impact do you think this has on you as a learner?
So the diagnosis or the ADHD itself, because those are two very different questions.
With the ADHD, I think it is a good place to start.
So the ADHD itself, that is quite a complicated question, because a lot of the difficulties I faced in education as a child, and to be clear, I say this on my blog, I did very well in school. I was, always considered a very bright, precocious child, annoyingly precocious, some people would say. But, I didn't ever do homework. So that's not an exaggeration. I did not hand in homework ever. I was constantly late to school. I was in detention pretty much every day, and not because I was behaving badly or just being disruptive or any of that, but a lot of my teachers actually quite liked me because I was talkative in class and I contributed, all of that kind of stuff, but purely because I was late and I wasn't handing in homework, so obviously put her in detention for the rest of her life. But a lot of that was really difficult, but I think a large part of it was that I didn't have an explanation for myself. I didn't know why I was the way that I was, and that caused a lot of difficulties with me because it really impacted my mental health. I write about it in the blog, but I had quite severe depression growing up, because it's just, you just think you're a terrible person. You just think, oh my God, I'm just lazy. And people will tell you that. Teachers will tell you that to your face. Most of them don't mean it in a horrible way, but you just accept the explanation that other people give you, which is that you're lazy and are not trying hard enough. And if you could just put more effort in, except the problem is you are putting so much effort in and you're not getting the return that you see other people getting. So that had a big impact on me. But in terms of my learning, I've never had an issue with grasping concepts or with the learning part of learning. It's all of the other stuff, the doing the homework, doing the assignments, doing them on time. That's a big one. And it's more of the sort of the administrative stuff for me. There are some sort of caveats to that. So I've never been able to do mental maths ever. I don't have the working memory to be able to hold those numbers in my head and manipulate them. But if you give me a piece of paper and a pen, then I'm actually quite good at maths. I actually had a really great maths tutor when I was doing my A levels, my AS. We used to have AS levels, those exams at the end of the first year. And I did really well. Like I got in the 90s for C1 and C2, core maths, because she put it in terms I understood. And I used a piece of paper and a pen, and I used a calculator because you're allowed to have those in at least one of those exams. But yeah, I mean, I thought I was really bad at maths for a long time because no one really took the time to explain it to me in a way that was accessible to me. And when you miss something in maths, it can be really difficult to catch up.
Yeah, we have one of the most vibrant parts of our community is kind of the maths circle, is the maths area of the community. And I think that's because of what you've just said, is actually that a math, the importance to the student of having a tutor in maths can be so much greater than in other subjects, because just as you've said, one misstep can cause real problems further down the line. So in that way, moving, I guess, to the diagnosis, did the diagnosis change the way that you viewed the work that you did, or change the way that you viewed the issues that you had compared to other students?
Yeah, so I mean, being diagnosed just completely changed my life. I mean, and that's not an exaggeration. Like, it really did. That was the turning point for me. So I was diagnosed in 2017, late 2017. And at the point at which I was diagnosed, I had failed my A levels, which was very predictable to me. There was always this thought, even when I was in secondary school, like, there's going to come a point where this isn't enough. Everyone's telling you that you're so smart and you're going to be fine, but you don't do any work. You just kind of show up and hope for the best. And that's not going to be enough one day. Like, how are you going to get through university like this? And yeah, I was completely correct. And I really thought that would be like the end of my life. And I've heard that from quite a lot of people who have, failed their A levels, not done as well as they could have done, or whatever else, that they're like, wow, it's the end of everything, which, looking back on it, is absolutely absurd. Yeah. that we teach kids that your life is over if you don't do education in exactly the way we tell you you're supposed to do it. So being diagnosed really changed my view of that. But also, it kind of gave me permission to let go of some of the shame that I'd been feeling for all of those years, because I was like, oh, there's a word for this. There's an explanation for this. It all makes sense. It was really a light bulb moment. And, I sort of could start work on forgiving myself and being patient with myself. And I was able to step back from the situation and take more of a pragmatic approach and be almost unemotional about the impairments that I have and the impact that it has on my life, and then start to strategize around how to work with or around them.
Yeah, I think if nothing else from this podcast, and I know that any listener who only takes one thing from this podcast has not been listening correctly, but if nothing else, then knowing that the diagnosis is not the kind of the end of the journey and the kind of the final barrier that falls, is one of the most powerful things. I think this is probably a good moment to take this conversation into kind of how that led you. You're talking there about how it led you to think slightly differently about the impact that it had on your learning, and how it gave you permission to think in a new way. Did was that in part what led you to go down into the route of tutoring?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've always really enjoyed teaching people. I'm very talkative, as I'm sure you may have noticed. But I was always the kind of the kid in the class that would, if someone didn't understand something that I did, I wanted to help them out with it and teach it to them and talk it through, and I really felt that benefited my learning as well. It wasn't just like me teaching. I think that we learn a lot from teaching, and it's still something that I think is a really great way of learning, is to teach other people a concept. But yeah, I happened to see an advert on my university careers portal for a tutoring job over the summer, and I was like, oh, this is great. I have a lot of free time, which didn't last, by the way. But at the time, I thought I had a lot of free time, and I really wanted to kind of make a difference, I guess. And I feel like I have a lot of really valuable insight and perspective into just how difficult and sometimes damaging the education system can be for kids, especially kids who, have impairments or difficulties or, disabilities, whatever you'd like to call it. Even kids who don't know they do, because that was me at the time. I had no idea there was anything sort of different about me. So I thought that it would be, I thought I could make some kind of a difference, or offer a unique perspective for kids who are in similar situations.
Yeah, and like so many other guests on this podcast, you had a really great tutor when you were a student, and I imagine that that's aided in some respects in not only the thought of becoming a teacher, but also the style in which you tutor.
Yeah, definitely. So the tutor that I had for my maths A levels, was a maths PhD student, and it was just really amazing how much she knew, but also the sort of passion that she had. I really like the agency that I'm with. Manning's has a lot of undergrad students and students who are in their subject, who their sort of whole thing is that they want people who are really passionate about their subjects, who really enjoy it. And I'm definitely one of those people. I love my subject. I currently study biomedical science, just for information.
For further relatability. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I was really struggling in maths because, as I said, if you miss something in maths, you've missed it, and it's really difficult. And also, I just didn't really like how they taught it, because it's very small picture a lot of the time. It's kind of, you do this one thing to solve this one type of problem, and I prefer to sort of understand why you do that so that you can apply it to more things. And she really helped me with that. And that's definitely something that I try to bring forward in how I tutor, is I try to give a bit of a bigger picture and a bit more of an understanding of how this slots in, because I think it can be really easy to lose that enjoyment of the subject and the sort of joy of learning. Sounds a bit cliche, but it can be so easy for schools to just really drain the your passion and your love of a subject. And it definitely did for me for a long time. It took some time for me to get back into education after that.
Yeah, and you've obviously shown incredible resolve to take yourself kind of from that place where the school was not supporting you, but many students perhaps won't have the support systems, or won't be in an academically kind of gifted situation to begin with, to I guess to take themselves out of that. So that's a really key motivating factor for making best use of a tutor, is that if a student is struggling with school, it doesn't mean that they're struggling with learning. It might just mean that they're struggling with the system and the structure that school imposes on them. And a tutor, as so many of the brilliant tutors on the QT community, including yourself, have shown, there are countless ways to elicit learning, and that's how a tutor can session in, week in, week out, they can tease out the best way that for that student to learn, just really by building that relationship with them. And I guess that leads me quite nicely on is in your experience, kind of as a student who's diagnosed with ADHD, what kind of are some of the best strategies for a tutor who's working with an ADHD student to employ in a session to make best use of that time?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, because I think that ADHD is such a varied condition and it has such varied presentation, that it can be really difficult to have a one size fits all approach to sort of tutoring or teaching a child with ADHD, or someone older with ADHD, anyone with ADHD. So something that would work for me may not work for other people. I've spoken about this before with a couple of people. This idea of like take frequent breaks can work really well for some students. So I spoke to Amanda about this actually. She spoke about this sort of boredom threshold, where you can see students approaching this. Okay, if they reach this boredom threshold, they're going to completely disconnect and be like, I don't want to do this. This is stupid. I'm over it. Let's finish. But if you can redirect them before that point and, maybe take a movement break or something like that, or, talk about something else, do something else for a little bit, sort of get them back to like, okay, I'm settled. And then you can reapproach it and go back to it. That could work really well. And definitely there are times where that would work well for me. But caveat, if a student is focused on something, especially a student with ADHD, you do not want to take a break. So for me, when I'm doing an assignment, for example, if I'm hyper focusing on it, it's this ability to like really tunnel vision focus, I'm always worried that if someone interrupts me or if I have to go and do something else, I'm going to lose it. I'm not going to be able to get back on track. So, having an individual approach to how students learn. And I also think a lot of it is to do with how you talk to and relate to students. I think that kids with ADHD are particularly susceptible to feelings of shame. I certainly was. I heard this great story from my friend who is training to be a teacher in Finland, not here. And she was talking about how she was watching another teacher teaching, sort of observing a lesson. And there was a young boy who had concentration difficulties and was very loud and excitable and would interrupt and all of that kind of stuff. And they noticed that the teacher was not telling him off for it and was not, saying, hey, this, sit down, this is inappropriate, etc. And they asked her afterwards, just out of curiosity, why were you not, correcting the behavior? And the teacher said, well, this child, last year, some teachers tried really hard to get him to correct his behavior, and it really knocked his self-confidence, and it really damaged his self-esteem. And, he was, clearly not, he wasn't okay anymore. So this is a conscious decision not to correct his behavior because he can't, he's not at a level where he can emotionally take that kind of correction. So, we're just going to let him do his thing, get back up to, being a happy child. And then afterwards, we can work on slowly, gently starting to see how we can improve like his behavior and make sure he's not disrupting other kids in the class.
Yeah. And that will come at a point where they feel that he's emotionally ready, and also importantly not in front of the rest of the class, which I imagine was also a big part of that situation. Just when you were talking about the boredom thresholds there, just remind me, sometimes when I'm delving deep into the Qualified Tutor podcast sort of listener data, I noticed that the boredom threshold for some of these podcasts is around about 30 minutes, I've noticed. So, even once we've left school, our boredom thresholds persist, shall we say. Something that we mentioned when we were talking about this podcast beforehand was that there is there are common misconceptions about ADHD, as with so many areas under the wider umbrella term of special educational needs. There's terms that people have heard before, but which they're not too sure of, and which they perhaps only know in the context of students who don't behave well, or who have who have left the education system. That's how we know so many of these terms, dyslexia and dyspraxia. So I was wondering that, Cleo, from your experience, what do you think is one common misconception about ADHD, and how can, speaking to on this podcast to the the countless listeners, how can people remedy this misconception?
So I think that's a great question. It's something that comes up a lot in the ADHD community, specifically the sort of adult ADHD community. There are a lot of misconceptions about ADHD. Unsurprisingly,
the start of your response, so perhaps you can go on for as many as you can think of.
So I think the big one is that the sort of typical ADHD child is a disruptive boy in the class who's, shouting out answers or being sometimes aggressive or anything like that. And certainly there are some ADHD children who do behave this way. I was not one of them. I mean, first of all, I'm not a boy. So, girls can have ADHD as well, but a lot of girls who have ADHD may present slightly differently. I know a lot of people who have ADHD who were model students. They overcompensated for their ADHD symptoms, and they basically became people pleasers, because they couldn't face any criticism, really. They didn't want anyone to sort of call them out for anything, so they became the absolute perfect student. And you would never think that they had ADHD if you sort of read their school reports or anything like that, but they were still really, really struggling. And similarly for me, I actually did have a lot of big red flags, big warning signs when I was diagnosed. I remember I brought in my school reports, because a big thing about ADHD is you have to have had it from childhood. And I brought in my school reports, and psychiatrist flipping through them and was just like, yeah, well, that's pretty typical, because they're all saying like, disorganized, doesn't remember her books, doesn't bring homework in, is late all the time. That's not something any teacher ever flagged up, any person in my life ever flagged up and said, hey, this is a problem, this is maybe something that we should look at. I think part of that's because I did well in tests, so it's not an issue, right? As long as you're doing well in school, what's the problem, really?
The notion of radars and slipping under them comes to mind.
Pretty much, yeah. And I think another thing is that ADHD is something that only children deal with, which is definitely not true. I know a lot of people who were not diagnosed with ADHD until they were fully grown people, and the impact that has on your life can be catastrophic. It's certainly, it felt like it was at the time. In hindsight, wasn't that bad, but for me, certainly it took me failing my A levels and sort of facing the idea that I might not be able to do the things that I really wanted to do with my life, to be like, okay, there's a problem here, there's something I need to do about this. And yeah, I also think that a lot of people think that children or people with ADHD can't be academically smart. There's this kind of like, oh, well, some people just aren't meant to become, doctors or scientists. It's just absolute rubbish. There are lots of people with ADHD. There are lots of doctors with ADHD, scientists with ADHD, researchers with ADHD. One of my closest friends is currently doing a PhD, and she was just diagnosed with ADHD. So it truly, anyone could have it, and you wouldn't necessarily know from looking at them.
Yeah. Anyone, and at any stage.
Yeah, really.
I think that's itself is a misconception, is that, just as you've just mentioned with your friend, that someone who has been through sixth form and university and their masters and is currently doing a PhD has only just been diagnosed, as if the idea of that can be fairly alien to many people. But I think, yeah, and I think that's true of other areas of this umbrella field of SEND, is that it impacts on intelligence, which is
which is grossly
certainly
unfair.
not all to. I mean, if you look at Sarah Rankin, for example, Professor Rankin at Imperial has dyslexia, for example. She's professor of, I think, leukocyte and stem cells. And I mean, she seems to be doing very well. So, there are certainly impairments that I've faced having ADHD. I think a big part of what's helped me to succeed, I did very well in my first year, despite us having, slight issues last year, is just the accommodations and support that I am now able to access because I have a diagnosis. And I think that makes a huge difference. So for me, I, will be very honest, I do get deadline extensions, and that's absolutely fine. But I'm not always able to do coursework or assignments within the set time that I'm given. That doesn't make me less able to do them. And I can do very well in them. I just may need slightly more time to do them in.
Yeah. I think what you've touched on there is really important, because, even kind of just looking at school children, I remember when I was at school, there was almost this unfair feeling from able-bodied students, or even just non-disabled students, that it was unfair that certain students got extra time. It was thought that it was just because they weren't clever enough. But looking back, that was just a completely wrong opinion and a completely wrong attitude that seemed to be spread through the student body. But I think just to finish up here, because that's discussing those boredom thresholds, we don't want to lose any of our listenership, but not that they will have been. This has been incredibly engaging, what you've been saying, Cleo, and also really a very important message. But you mentioned something just at the end there, which I thought was we couldn't really finish this conversation without mentioning, which is, how has the move online affected ADHD students? It must have been ADHD students and learners as well. It must continue to be a very distracting part of online learning, in that concentration is lost before non-disabled students. So what can you give just a few insights into how the ADHD community has responded to the move to online learning?
Yeah, so for me personally, it's been very challenging. I had a lot of strategies in place pre-pandemic that I am not able to do now. So things like working with friends in groups, working in coffee shops, in the library. I used to go to the library at my university every single day and try and get some work done, because I found it very difficult to focus at home, because, Netflix is at home. It's very difficult.
Netflix is everywhere, Cleo.
Yeah, very true. But it seems less socially acceptable to go to your university library and catch up on some TV you've missed. Yeah, so that's certainly an issue. And also the fact that so all of my lectures are pre-recorded and posted, and we do have sort of time slots where we're supposed to watch them, but I know they're not real. I know I can watch them at any time. That's a big problem, because that means that half of my brain is saying, just watch them later. But it says that all the time. So it's this task initiation can be a really big problem with ADHD, and even just getting yourself to your desk and sitting and opening it up and getting the lecture up. I know this is slightly different when you have synchronous and live sessions, but yeah, getting yourself to actually do that has been really difficult. I've found that routines help. I've been very much trying to get up at the same time every day. I have this is a great tip. I have this app on my phone. It's called Alarmy. You can get a lot of different versions of this. It's a barcode alarm clock. You take anything away from this, if you really struggle to get out of bed, buy one of these, print out a barcode, scan it with this app, stick it in your kitchen, and then the alarm will not turn off until you go all the way to your kitchen to scan it with your camera. It's brilliant. It's really helped me, genuinely, because by the time I'm in my kitchen, I'm like, well, I'm awake now. So yeah.
No danger of just falling back to sleep on the kitchen floor then.
Exactly. Well, depends how tired I am, but
okay.
It's been difficult. I will also say technology has been a huge help. There's another website that I wanted to mention. I think it's called, let me look it up really quickly so I don't get it wrong. It's called Zones or something like that. Hours.zone. It's a virtual study website. And essentially you can start sessions with your friends or, with whatever else. I know there's a Discord group for people to study together, and you can see each other's to-do lists and start timers and all of that kind of stuff. And you can have video on or off, that kind of thing. That has been really useful. And this idea of virtual body doubling. Body doubling is a really common thing that gets brought up in the ADHD community. It's essentially where you have someone else sit with you or be present while you're doing a task. They don't have to be involved in the task. They don't have to be helping you with the task, but just having another person there can really help you get it done. Don't ask me why, but it does genuinely help. It's like if you wanted to clean your room and you're like, okay, I'm going to invite a friend over and just say, just hang out with me, we'll listen to music, and that I'm supposed to be cleaning my room, and that's going to mean that I clean my room.
It's almost sort of like invigilating, but
pretty much.
Perhaps not quite.
It's this external motivation to get you to do things.
And that's really why studying groups. Well, one reason why studying groups can be so effective, can't it? There's only so much procrastinating you can do. Amongst others, especially if there's a common objective. But thank you so much, Cleo. I feel bad, curtailing this, because I know that there's so much more to come, and we would absolutely welcome another podcast which explores some of the things that we've mentioned here, and other parts of, especially lessons and skills that we can take from the ADHD community that can help both us, non-ADHD diagnosed individuals understand the diagnosis a bit more, but also skills that we can just use in our learning, because there's a whole load of untapped strategies and resources that are there within. So thank you very much for coming on. We've
no worries. It's been really nice.
You've joined us in the community, Cleo. It's been wonderful having you and having your voice in the conversations. The blog will be in the show notes below, and you can also find on our website and also on the platform Medium, where it was first published. That's one of the best pieces of writing I've read this year so far. So do go and have a read.
Thank you so much.
And that will inform a lot of what we've talked about today. But thank you, Cleo. I hope you've enjoyed discussing some of your experiences on here.
Yeah, it's been really nice. I mean, I can talk for hours. So, but if anyone wants to chat with me about any of this, find me on Twitter. I'm around. I'm probably putting off watching my lectures. So
please talk to me on Twitter. Is actually you should be saying, and do get in touch with Cleo within the community as well, if that's somewhere that you'd like to be. But I wish you a very wonderful rest of the afternoon, Cleo, and
thank you. You too.
In the community afterwards. Okay.
All right.
Bye then. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Qualified Tutor podcast, where tutors share their expertise to support the tutoring community. If you'd like to continue the conversation, join our Qualified Tutor community at www.qualifiedtutorcommunity.org or find it in the show notes below. We exist to connect, share, and learn with you, because tutoring is a small job that makes a big difference.